How much protein is optimal for our health and longevity? It's a question that seems to divide the scientific community. On one side, highly decorated scientists like Dr. Valter Longo warn of the dangers of high protein intake, especially in middle age. He claims there is no evidence that excess protein is good for us. On the other side, we see a trend toward higher protein diets fueled by figures like Dr. Peter Attia, who recommends up to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, or Dr. Rhonda Patrick, who suggests a range of 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram. Who is right? And where do we land when we consider all the evidence? For many years, we've personally aimed for a protein intake of about 1.6 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight. And that's the advice we've often given. But a closer look at the current research has us rethinking a slightly adjusted recommendation. Before we get to that, we need to take a closer look at Dr. Valter Longo's arguments because they are incredibly convincing and align with many common dietary guidelines worldwide. The argument against high protein intake. One of his most important studies, published in 2014 in the prestigious journal Cell Metabolism by Levine and colleagues, examined the relationship between protein intake, cancer, and mortality rates over a period of 18 years in over 6,000 adults aged 50 and older. The results for the age group between 50 and 65 were particularly revealing. The group with the highest protein intake had a 74% higher risk for overall mortality and a more than fourfold higher risk of dying from cancer compared to the group that consumed little protein. These alarming figures suggest that high protein intake, especially from animal sources, can pose significant health risks, above all with regard to cancer mortality. But what's the reason for this? The underlying mechanism is relatively simple, even if the details are complex. We've long known that calorie restriction can extend lifespan and reduce age-related diseases in mice and other organisms. This happens by signaling to the cells that they are in a resource-scarce environment, which stimulates a state of cellular repair and maintenance. In contrast, an abundant intake of calories and a lot of protein signals to the cells, "It's time to grow, we have the resources, so step on the gas!" It's a bit like the two phases we experience daily. During the day, we are active. At night, we are in a state of rest and repair. And how does this fit with cancer? Cancer arises when cells mutate and grow uncontrollably, like a fire breaking out of the fireplace. If we add more fuel, the fire gets worse. The same is true for cancer. Dr. Longo's team found in animal experiments that higher protein levels accelerated cancer growth. Protein itself doesn't act directly, but through complex cellular pathways. One of the most important is the mTOR signaling pathway, a master regulator for cell growth, metabolism, and survival. mTOR recognizes the availability of amino acids, glucose, and growth factors, with the amino acid leucine being particularly influential. In times of plenty, mTOR signals to cells that it's time for growth and reproduction. In times of resource scarcity, it tells cells to slow down and prioritize repair processes. So does this mean we should all strive for a low-protein diet? Not necessarily. Dr. Longo emphasizes that it's less about protein in general and more about specific amino acids, and most importantly, the protein source. His studies found that the negative effects were mainly due to the consumption of animal protein, while plant-based protein was not an issue. Animal proteins, it is hypothesized, are richer in certain amino acids that more strongly drive growth factors like insulin-like growth factor 1, IGF-1. The second important limitation is age. The negative associations between high protein intake and cancer were only valid up to the age of 65. After that, the trend reversed. For older adults, low protein intake was associated with higher cancer mortality. The researchers concluded that after age 65, higher protein intake may be necessary to reduce age-related weight loss and other health problems. And thirdly, Dr. Longo's recommendations are by no means low. For adults under 65, he recommends an intake of 0.69 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, which is at the upper end of the current recommended dietary allowance of 0.8 grams per kilogram. This is still half of the 1.6 gram target we have recommended so far. The question, therefore, is, should we adjust our target? The case for higher protein intake. The answer isn't that simple because the story isn't over yet. Dr. Longo's focus is heavily on preventing cancer mortality. But that's not our only health concern. Muscle loss, for example, is a major worry in old age. We see this in our society daily. Older people become frail, losing their independence. This muscle loss, known as sarcopenia, begins in our 30s and accelerates with age. Between 40 and 80 years, muscle mass can decrease by 30 to 50%, especially during times of illness. Professor Lars Larsson and colleagues from the Karolinska Institute in Sweden describe this age-related loss as a complex, multifactorial process in which the neuromuscular system undergoes continuous reorganization. Added to this is the model of the catabolic crisis. We don't just lose muscle slowly and continuously, but especially in short periods of reduced physical activity or illness, such as after just 1 week of bed rest, which can lead to a loss of 1.4 kilograms of muscle mass. This loss is often not fully recovered, which accumulates over the years and leads to a significant loss of function. This is a serious problem that limits mobility, reduces quality of life, and increases the risk of fall-related injuries. Is the often recommended protein intake of 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight then sufficient to maintain and rebuild muscle mass in old age? An international expert group is pushing for higher protein intake goals of 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight per day for healthy individuals over 65. Observational studies support this. One study showed that adults between 70 and 79 years who consumed 1.1 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight daily lost 40% less lean body mass over a 3-year period than those with a lower intake of 0.8 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight. Since muscle loss can begin early in life, it would be sensible to increase protein intake to a level that maximizes muscle growth in younger years. This is where the target of 1.6 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight comes into play. A comprehensive meta-analysis by Morton et al. From 2017, published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, examined the effect of protein supplementation on muscle gain in response to resistance training. It showed that as protein intake increased, the response to resistance training also increased, up to a point. Above 1.62 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, there were no further benefits in terms of muscle mass. A more recent meta-analysis from 2022 supplemented these findings and found a significant turning point at about 1.3 grams per kilogram. Up to this value, an increase in protein intake had a big impact on the increase in lean body mass. After that, the effects were much smaller. This means we can achieve most of the benefits from protein intake at a slightly lower value than the 1.6 gram target, but still significantly higher than Dr. Longo's suggestion of 0.8 grams or less. Besides muscle mass, protein also plays a crucial role in weight management. Obesity is a major risk factor for a variety of diseases. According to the World Health Organization, overweight was responsible for an estimated 3.7 million deaths worldwide in 2022. Effective weight loss strategies are therefore crucial. Studies have shown that a higher protein intake helps with weight loss and weight maintenance. A meta-analysis comparing high-protein diets with standard diets of the same calorie count showed that the higher protein groups had significantly greater reductions in body weight and fat mass. What's more, they even gained or better maintained lean body mass. This is crucial because significant weight loss is almost always accompanied by some muscle loss, something we absolutely want to avoid. Another study found that groups with a normal protein intake during a 12-week calorie-restricted diet lost almost twice as much lean muscle mass as groups with a high protein intake, although the total weight loss in both groups was similar. In addition, the high-protein groups felt fuller and enjoyed their food more during the diet. At this point, we need to address another important topic: kidney health. For a long time, there was concern that high-protein diets could strain the kidneys, especially in people with kidney disease. Current guidelines recommend a low-protein intake in later stages of chronic kidney disease. However, a groundbreaking study by Carballo-Casla et al., published in 2024, shows that a higher protein intake in older patients with mild to moderate chronic kidney disease significantly reduces mortality. Surprisingly, those with a daily protein intake of 1.6 grams per kilogram of lean body weight had a 33% lower risk of death than those with 0.8 grams. The researchers concluded that the benefits of protein outweigh possible risks, and this applies to many people with kidney disease. This underscores an essential point. In the field of health, it's never just about a single factor. Instead, we have to weigh a variety of risks and benefits to find the sweet spot that gives us the best overall health outcomes. Given the importance of muscle mass and weight management for our overall health, especially in a world where many of us are overweight, the evidence we have looked at points to a higher protein intake for most people to achieve the best overall health results. Reconciling the evidence, but we know the concern about cancer, which Dr. Longo warns about, is still looming. For most of us, the word cancer is serious enough that we can't ignore this risk, even if a high protein intake brings convincing benefits. Let's look at the data more closely. First, it is important to note that the current evidence on the relationship between protein intake and cancer is somewhat contradictory. A large umbrella review by Kuhn et al. Published in 2024 analyzed systematic reviews on this topic and found no statistically significant association between total protein intake and the risk for colon cancer or breast cancer. For other types of cancer, the data was often insufficient to make a clear statement. What about overall mortality? On the one hand, various studies have found a link between higher protein intake and a higher mortality risk. For example, a large cohort study found a 12% higher risk of death for those in the highest protein group compared to the lowest. But here's a crucial detail. Just as with Dr. Longo's study, which we discussed at the beginning, higher mortality risks were associated with animal protein, more specifically with protein from dairy products and meat that was not fish. In contrast, a higher intake of protein from sources like nuts and beans was associated with a lower risk of death. A separate cohort study, the Isfahan cohort study by Hagigat Dust et al. From 2023, confirmed this pattern. A higher intake of animal protein increased the mortality risk by a full 52%, while a higher intake of plant-based proteins lowered the risk by 36%. However, not every animal protein was problematic. In fact, protein from fatty fish was associated with a decreased mortality risk. Another comprehensive meta-analysis by Nagshi et al., published in 2020 in the British Medical Journal, which included 32 cohort studies, underpins all these points. It found that total protein intake was associated with a lower risk for overall mortality and not an increase in cancer mortality. And here, too, it was shown that plant-based protein correlated particularly strongly with better health outcomes. We know from a lot of data that red and processed meat is particularly unhealthy, and the high proportion of saturated fatty acids in these sources is a specific risk factor for heart disease. These considerations lead us to an important conclusion. It is probably not the total amount of protein that should worry us. Instead, we must ensure that the protein sources we choose are healthy. This means that plant-based sources like legumes, nuts, and beans should be in the foreground, but fatty fish and lean meat can also be part of a healthy diet. The sweet spot for protein intake. When we summarize all the data we've looked at in this episode, where do we land? What is the right amount of protein to maximize health benefits? Here's how we think about it. The maintenance of muscle mass and weight control are of immense importance for overall health, especially in old age. And we have seen that protein intakes in the range of about 1.2 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight per day seem to be optimal in these areas. As far as muscle mass is concerned, the gains we achieve beyond the 1.3 gram mark, at least on average, are relatively small. The 1.6 gram target that we have recommended in the past is likely a bit higher than necessary for most. We will slightly reduce our general recommendation from 1.6 grams to 1.2 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight per day. To calculate this, for example, you can use an ideal body weight calculator. For a person aiming for an ideal body weight of, for example, 78 kilograms, that would mean, multiplied by 1.2, it results in 93.6 grams of healthy proteins per day. And as for Dr. Longo's concerns about cancer, the available evidence seems to indicate that animal protein, and not necessarily total protein intake, is the problem, especially red and processed meat as well as dairy products. This is another reason to stick with the advice we already give. Prioritize plant-based proteins and choose lean meats if you want to eat meat. And fatty fish is a particularly good source of protein. Dr. Longo also advocates for a lower protein intake to promote longevity and combat age-related diseases. In this case, however, we want to come back to what we already mentioned. We have to consider a variety of factors when it comes to our health. Suppose protein restriction would give us a slight increase in longevity. This might not be worth it if it increases our chances of impaired mobility through muscle loss. Our understanding of the effects of protein intake on longevity is still preliminary. Better data in the future could shift the cost-benefit analysis here. But for now, we will advise aiming for a target value of about 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of ideal body weight per day. It is important to emphasize that we must be sensitive to individual differences. As we have seen, age plays a role, as does the activity level. The needs of a young athlete who wants to increase their overall performance are not the same as those of a middle-aged person who wants to maintain their fitness. We can use a pea protein powder, for example, as it helps to reach protein goals more easily and contains relatively little of the amino acid methionine. Dr. Longo's research has identified methionine as potentially harmful with regard to cancer growth. And when it comes to meal planning, we advise being a bit strategic because there's much more to consider than just protein intake. But it doesn't have to be overly complicated either. We would like to thank you very much for spending this episode with us. Your support and interest mean a lot to us. We hope you were able to take away exciting insights and valuable food for thought. Stay curious, informed, and inspired. Together, we are shaping a better future. As always, we wish everyone a long, healthy, and happy life. Until next time.